Hello there, and thanks for joining me. I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Rebelle 2. Rebelle 2 is a digital painting application, and it stands out because it has a really nice, realistic fluid or water simulation, meaning that you can paint in watercolor and acrylics and gouache, and you can get a really nice painterly effect. The paint can run and blend together and drip and drizzle. It gives you some really cool results. Behind me, you can see a portrait painting that I created here in Rebelle 2. This is the very first portrait that I've ever created in Rebelle, and I think it turned out pretty good. I created this using mostly the watercolor brush presets with very few tweaks to the settings here. I got a lot of this done with just a few tools, and it didn't take me that long to learn. I actually just picked it up as I went along. And that's one of the nice things about Rebelle is it's a very simple interface and it's very intuitive. So in this video, I'm just going to give a general overview of the application and share my thoughts on it. And I'll show you how you can do some basic painting here in Rebelle. So first of all, you have your tools here. These are all the different kinds of media that you can create. You have watercolor, acrylic, pastel, pencil, ink pen, marker, airbrush, and then your eraser, which works on all media. You can erase anything with that. Then below that, you have a few different tools. You have your blend. You can blend different colors together. Then you have your smudge. That's if you wanted to smudge paint and maybe reshape something. Then you have your water, which lets you wet areas of your canvas so that the paint will run and drizzle. Then you have your sponge, which can dry wet areas to keep them from running. You have undo and you have redo. Then you have this blow here where you can blow air to push paint across the canvas. And then you have your dropper or your color sampler that'll let you sample colors off of your canvas. Next to that is the transform tool. If you wanted to make something bigger or smaller or squish it or rotate it, you can do that. And then you have your selection tools. If you wanted to create a selection of an area to stencil something off, you can do that. Below that, we have the settings for each kind of media here. You can see that changes depending on the media that you select. For example, in watercolor, there's a size setting to control the size of your brush. There's a pressure setting to control the amount of pressure that you're using. There's loading, which controls how much paint is on the brush, and water, which controls how wet the paint or the brush is. So just to give you a quick example of that, if I want to take a color like this red here, and I want to set the water to 1, that's its lowest setting, and I paint, and I'm getting this dry brush effect, and the paint isn't going to run. However, if I set the water up to 100%, and I paint a stroke, and we watch, you can see that it's spreading out and trickling, and it's a lot more thin and transparent, and it doesn't cover the painting so opaquely. It's actually taking some of the color from the background and mixing it as well. Beneath that, we have the different modes of the brush. Right now I'm using a normal brush, which means that it's going to change depending on my loading setting here. So if I set the loading low, then I'm only going to get a little wispy stroke. If I set the loading high, I'll get a big thick stroke. If I want my brush to maintain its loading setting, I can just click on permanent brush here. And then I'll always have that loading setting maintained. I can also enable dirty brush, and then I can paint, and my brush will always pick up that dirty color of paint that's underneath. It'll be constantly mixing with the other colors. Or I can use a clean brush, which won't have any paint on it, a completely clean brush, and that'll work kind of like a blender to soften edges. So it doesn't actually have any of its own paint. And then last in that row is the eraser button, which can turn any brush into an eraser. So if I click on that, I can actually erase my paint from this canvas, which is something you can't do with traditional watercolor quite this easily. And then beneath that, we have the brush presets. There's presets for each category. So right now I'm in the watercolor category. I have a liner, I have a filbert, I have a round brush. These are all different shaped brushes. You could think of all the different brush tips that you can get when you're working with traditional paint. That's basically what you're getting here. And if you want to, in Rebelle 2, you can now create your own custom brushes. So if you want to tweak one of these brushes and add your own settings to it, or create a brush, let's say a brush that looks like a clump of leaves, you could do that. To do that, you'd go into the window menu and then open the brush creator. And now you can see with this liner brush here, this is what the brush stroke's going to look like. But I could change that. I could change the spacing. I could scatter it a bit. I can increase the opacity. And now if I paint with this brush, I'm getting a completely different result here. If I reduce the spacing, jitter, and the scatter, I get something that's a little less random. So that could help if you want a more irregular edge to your stroke. If you scroll down, there's a few more settings here for size jitter and angle jitter. I'm not going to go into huge detail about creating brushes in this particular tutorial, but I just wanted to show you that this is here and it's a new feature. I'm going to go ahead and hide the brush creator. Over here on the other side, we have the navigator, which is showing you a thumbnail of your image as you're working on it. You can also use it to zoom in and out. You can rotate your view of your canvas. You can reset that view by clicking on the reset button here. And you can size your canvas to 100% with the little magnifier. Next to that, you can size it to fit the screen, which is really handy. You can flip your canvas horizontal, which really helps you judge mistakes and get a fresh view of your piece. You can also use a multi-touch. So I'm going to turn on my Cintiq here, and then I can use touch gestures to size my canvas and move it around and rotate it. If I want to blend, I can use my finger as a blender, and you can see I can smudge this around as if it were a real canvas. And I can take my pen, and I can just start painting and smudge. If you want to expand and collapse the view of palettes, you can click on these little bars here. That'll just toggle them open and closed. Now in the top right of a lot of these palettes, there's this little 3-bar looking icon here. And you can get to some sub-menu options by clicking on that, depending on the palette. So for example, I can set this to grayscale to temporarily view it in grayscale. I can also hit G on my keyboard to do that. And that's really helpful to be able to see the value structure of your piece while you're working. Next to that in the navigator, we have the Tilt tab. If you have a tablet that has an accelerometer, which can recognize when you turn your tablet, it'll flip the screen tall rather than wide, you can actually use that to tilt and drip the paint. But you can control that here with the tilt as well. For example, if I add a lot of water to my paint, and I put down some paint here and we watch it run, I can enable tilt by turning on that center button. You can see right now it's going straight down, but I could take it and I could tilt it over to the left, and all of a sudden the paint changes direction. I could turn it up, and you can see I can even drive the paint in real time if I want to. Curve it down. Then I can go ahead and turn the tilt off. Then it'll just expand from the center again, and if I want to dry my canvas, you can do that and it freezes all of the paint as if you instantly dried it. Beneath that we have the color palette, which has the color picker. There's a hue ring, which lets you select the hue or the pure color. I can drag along that ring to select a magenta or yellow or whichever color I want. And then within the center you have the cube, which represents the value on the vertical axis, that's light to dark. And then saturation is represented left to right. Saturation is how intense is the color, or how muted is the color. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are sub-dialogues in the top right. We can change this to a square view if we want something like this with a hue strip. We can turn sliders on and off if we want to adjust the sliders. If we don't like HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness, we can change that to RGB. You'll have to do that in the square mode, but I prefer HSL, so I'm going to keep it set to that. Next to that in the tab, we have the color sets. If you just want some little paint swatches to pick from while you're painting, which is kind of like getting the little tubes of traditional paint, you can pick color sets from an image. You can create your own color sets. A lot of that can be done from the dialog menu here, and there's lots of different color set libraries to choose from. If these panels are too big, you can resize them. See, I can drag on this bar here, or I can make it wider if I want that to be bigger. Beneath that, we have layers, and layers let you stack paint in different layers. I can add a layer here with the Add Layer button. Then I can take some paint and put it down. And that paint, if I want to take it and move it, is completely separate. Now I can move it over here. I can make that paint bigger if I want to. Hit Enter to go ahead and apply that. I can also change the blend mode, which changes the consistency of the paint. If I want the paint to be more like a thin, transparent ink, I can set the blend mode to multiply. And now it's kind of tinting over the piece. And if I paint and I let it drip, you can see that it's flowing over the piece as if it's a thin, transparent glaze. And I can reduce the opacity of that glaze with the opacity slider here. I'm going to go ahead and dry that layer. There's a few different buttons in the top of the layers panel. There's the Show Wet button, which shows you which layers are currently wet. So if I paint with a wet brush, that blue is representing water. And I can hide that visibility of that, which just shows me which areas are wet. If I go ahead and dry my layer by clicking on the Dry button, you can see that now that wetness goes away. I'm going to paint in some red over here. And let's take a look at the Pause Diffusion button. If I pause diffusion, that's going to freeze the flow of the paint, but it's not going to stop it and dry it in the same way. It's not permanently dried, it's just on pause. If I unpause it, you can see that it starts to flow again. Then I can pause it, and I can paint a little bit, and I'm painting and it's keeping my paint frozen in time. So if I wanted to layer up a bunch of different colors of paint without them flowing yet, I could put them down like this, and then I could simply unpause it and they'll all instantly start to flow together as if they were created simultaneously. We can also wet layers. I'm going to wet this layer of my face here. If I paint with a wet brush on a wet layer, the whole canvas is going to interact as if I put water over everything first and then put paint down on top of it. Next is dry layer, which is going to dry everything, but there's also fast dry, and fast dry is going to dry the contents of the layer that you're painting on, but it'll keep the canvas wet. So anywhere else where it's still wet will stay wet. There's a keyboard shortcut which you can use to apply that, which is F. So if you want to paint really quickly here and then just hit F to dry just that layer, you can do that. As I mentioned, you have the blend mode and you have the opacity for the layer. You can also lock the layer itself so that you can't accidentally paint on it. You can see I'm trying to paint and I'm getting that lock. And I can unlock it and then I can paint on it. You can also use this icon here to lock the transparency of a layer. Then beneath that, we have all the individual layers that are in the artwork. So if I create a layer here of this blue, create another layer with some green, you can see that that little icon shows you what's on that layer visually. You can also name the layer. I could name that layer green. Just double click on the name. You can hide the visibility of a layer by clicking on the eyeball to show and hide it temporarily. You can rearrange the layers. We could put the blue on top of the green. I'll use the transform tool just to move it. Hit enter to apply that transformation. I'll move the blue beneath the green, and now the green's on top of the blue. So you can rearrange or restack your layers of paint. So as I showed you earlier, you can use layers for things like glazing and controlling your paint and moving it around, but layers also give you a lot of flexibility because you don't have to risk messing something up. If you wanted to repaint a nostril or an eyelash or something, you could paint that on a separate layer, and if you're not happy with that change, you can always delete that layer without having to repaint the entire nose, for example. So I could delete a layer by clicking on the delete layer button. I can duplicate layers by clicking on the duplicate button. Now I have a duplicate here. If I wanted to merge individual layers into a single layer, I could do that. So I could fuse these two green paint layers together using the merge button. And now they're a single layer. If I wanted to merge all my layers down with the canvas, I could do that as well. I could simply select all of my layers. I'm holding Shift to select a range of layers. I can merge them together, and now that green paint is part of my canvas. And if I wanted to blend it and smudge it around, I could do that. Down here near the bottom of the layers palette, we can show and hide the canvas texture. And if we want to edit that canvas texture, we can double click here on the canvas icon. If I wanted to change this from this watercolor paper to something that looks more like a traditional canvas, I could do that. I could also tone the canvas. I can control the visibility or the amount of texture and the scale of the texture if I want it to be bigger or smaller. Paint structure will control the thickness of the paint. So if I want my paint to show really thick, I'll turn paint structure up. If I want it to be very flat and not have any texture at all, I'll turn it down to 0. I'm going to click on OK. Now you can see that the canvas texture changed from watercolor to canvas. I'm going to do an undo and put it back to watercolor paper. When we're working with selections, we can show and hide our selection overlay color to show where you're going to be stenciling off. For example, I could create a new layer and I could put in some wet paint here inside of this stencil. The red area is the stencil itself. You could think of that as paper or something that's blocking the paint. And the only place that's going to apply paint to the canvas is the inside of the stencil here, or the negative space. So if I deselect that selection with Control D, then you can see that the paint is running outside of that selection because it's dripping, but it's as if I applied a stencil. I can simply dry it like that. And then last but not least, for all the boring interface stuff, up at the top we have the File menu, the Edit menu, the Layer menu, the View menu, the Window menu, which controls all of your palettes. So if you're missing a palette, make sure it's checked here. And then the Help menu. I recommend checking out the Help and reading the manual if you have any other questions that I don't cover in this video. So now you know where all the tools are at. Let's take a look at how to actually do a little bit of painting here in Rebelle. I'm going to go to File and New. Now each time you launch Rebelle, you're probably going to get this new artwork window, which has some different presets and lets you choose a new canvas size. If you don't like this popping up constantly, you can turn it off in the preferences. I'm going to set my measurement to inches. I'm going to set my DPI, or my dots per inch, or my resolution, which controls the detail in your piece. I'm going to set that to 300. I'm going to make this an 8 by 10. I'm going to choose a standard canvas size here because if I want to print this on canvas or on paper, 8 by 10 is a standard frame and print size. I'm going to click on OK. Now I have my standard 8 by 10 canvas. Now I'm going to double click here on canvas, and I'm going to make this texture scale a little bit bigger because the scale of the paper texture was much too small and fine. And let's do a little bit of painting here. Let's start with the acrylic brush, and let's choose the round preset. Let's choose a black color. I'm going to hold down Control on my keyboard, and I'm going to drag my pen. And you can see that makes my brush larger. Or if I want to make it smaller, I can do that. I can also control the size over here. Now if you're using a drawing tablet, you should be able to use pen pressure. So if I press lightly I'll get a thinner line, and if I press hard, I'll get a thick line. You can see it tapers off at the end if I press it very lightly. If I want control over that pen pressure, or if it seems like you're not getting any pen pressure at all, what you'll want to do is go up to the File menu and go to Preferences and look under Tablet. If you're using a Wacom device, make sure it's set to WinTab. If you're using a Microsoft Ink device, you want to check Microsoft Ink. If you want multi-touch to be enabled, you can check that. You can also play with the sensitivity. If it's too sensitive, you can turn it down. If it's not sensitive enough, you can turn it up. And here's where you can change the pen pressure sensitivity. I tend to press down really hard when I paint, so I'm going to set mine to firm. You can also calibrate your Wacom tablet further in the Wacom tablet properties in your control panel. I'm going to click on OK, and you can test your pen and see if it's working the way that you want it to. Now that we know how to make some little doodles, we can try some of the different media here. We can try watercolor and pencil. And don't forget, there's a bunch of different presets here you can try as well for each of these. You can try the airbrush if you want kind of an airbrushed effect. And you can go over all of these. If you wanted to add water to the airbrush, you could certainly do that. And we can make the airbrush drip. If we wanted to make the pencil drip, we could do that. So you could think of it like you're adding turpentine or some sort of thinner to colored pencils to make them drip. So that's the cool thing about working with digital art, is you can mix media together in all kinds of different ways. I'm going to go ahead and hit F to fast dry my layer so that my paint stops dripping. Let's do a little blending with the blender. I'm going to use the hard preset. I'm going to go ahead and use my finger to blend a little bit here. Now I can do this at any time just using my finger if I choose to, but I could also select the blender with my pen, and I could simply just blend that way using my pen. We can also smudge. If we want to push stuff around and kind of resculpt things, it works really well for that. You can also blend with smudge if you want a softer blending effect. Now let's play with wetness a little bit. I'm going to add some wet purple paint here using the watercolor. And let's set it to tilt straight down. We can see the water is running. Let's go ahead and dry that. And let's wet the canvas again. Let's select the water. Let's paint some water here near the bottom. You can hide the visibility of the water, and you can see that it's pulling the paint down with it. Now if I want to, I can use the sponge, and I can dry some areas of it. If I hide the visibility, you can see that now it's only going to drip on one side. The other side where it's dry, it's not dripping anymore. We can also play with blow. I can select the blow tool and we can push this way. And that kind of takes the paint and kind of pushes it over to the side. I'm going to turn off my tilt. I'm going to blow this kind of sideways here. And you can see that it's starting to take off over to the other direction. I'll push it back the other way. You can get it to change course. And I can turn my tilt back on and just let it drip straight down. Let's add a little more water to it. Now personally, I think this overlay is kind of annoying each time it comes on. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. If you want to change that, you can go to File Preferences. And if we look under Tools, we can turn off Show Wet Layer when using water or dry tools. While we're in this menu, we can take a look at a couple of other things. For example, if you want to add some smoothing to your strokes to make your strokes smoother, you can increase the lazy mouth strength. If you have an accelerometer on your tablet, you can change the sensitivity of that here. If you don't like the red circle that you get when you're resizing your brush using the shortcut, you can change that to another color. And you can adjust the transformation lock angle increments. So now if I add some water to this, and then I go through and I dry it with the sponge, I'm not seeing that blue each time. So now what do I do if I want to clear everything that's on this layer? I can go to Edit, Layer, Clear Layer, or I can just hit Delete on my keyboard, and that'll clear everything off that layer. Let's go ahead and draw a quick sketch of an eye. I'm going to use the pencil. I'm going to use the 2B pencil. I'll select a gray pencil color, and I'll just sketch in a simple eye here. I'm not going to do anything too detailed. I just want to give you an idea of how you can paint part of a piece of a painting here. Maybe we'll have the highlight be right around here. So we have our anatomy of our eye. We can create a new layer. We can move that beneath our first layer that we created for the sketch. And let's just name that sketch so we know what it is. If it's too dark, we can reduce the opacity of it. On the layer underneath, let's call that paint. Let's use some watercolor paint for this. I'm going to use the round brush. Make my brush smaller. And before I paint, what if I want to mask off an area like the highlight of the eye using masking fluid? We can now do this in Rebelle version 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an extra layer here. I'm going to call it masking. Let's just pick a color for our masking fluid that we can see. And maybe we'll use an acrylic brush for this. We'll use the round preset. And we'll reserve just this area here. So this will represent the area that we're masking. I'm going to click on the Stencils tab. I'll click on the little sub-dialog menu. And I'll choose Create Stencil from Layer. I'm going to click on the little sub-dialog button here on the stencil itself. And I'm going to go to Invert. Now basically what that's done is that's just selected that as my area for my stencil. Now I can hide that masking layer. I can go back to my paint layer. I can go back to my watercolor brush. And I can begin putting in some different colors here for my eye. I'm going to go ahead and just fast dry with F. I'm going to reduce the water so that I have more of a dry brush. I'm going to go ahead and put in some skin color surrounding that. We'll do the pupil color in the center there. Now when I'm done with that mask, I can click on the sub-dialog here, and I can choose Remove, and hide my sketch, and you can see that it reserved that area there where it didn't apply any paint. Now that's one way to do it, or you could simply just take your eraser and you could erase paint like that. Or if you wanted to, you could create a new layer. You could select white, and you could take something like the acrylic. You could reduce the water all the way down to 1, and you could paint in a highlight that way as well. Now the lighter you press, the more you're going to get paper grain. And one of the things I really like about Rebelle is you're always getting this paper grain. So it's not something that you can accidentally paint over, and your paint kind of blends into the grain. For example, if I select the blender and I start smudging, you can see that I'm getting that grain as I'm blending. So I'm going to use the blender just to blend this a little bit. This is a pretty sloppy version of an eye, but it's giving you an idea of the basics of how you could create a painting. And then if you wanted to, you could go through with more dry brushes, add in a little more detail here. Now if you wanted to make some corrections, you could use the smudge tool. And for example, you could sculpt that into a better looking shape. If I wanted, I could take it and I could transform it. I could squish it down, move it into place. Now I showed you how to create a stencil for masking fluid, but there's also some stencils in here if you just want to play around with these different things. For example, I could take this stencil here and move it over here, scale it down. This is the move button, this is the scale button, this is the rotate button. If I wanted to put in a leaf here, I could do that. Add some water to that and paint over the whole thing with some different colors. And then go ahead and remove that stencil. Fast dry my layer with F, and you can see I got that nice stenciled effect for that leaf. So because I don't want this video to be too long and I want it to kind of be more of an overview, I'm not going to go into every single feature of Rebelle. You can read through the instruction manual, or perhaps I'll make a few more videos about how to use the more technical features of this. But I want to keep this one kind of short, and I've already gone pretty long. But let's take a look at a few of the other kinds of media. We have the pastels. We didn't try those yet. Could try blending them with some other colors here. You can try the ink pen. This is like a fountain pen, so it can be really wet and runny if you want it to. I can turn up the water on it really high, or I can add water to it using the water tool to make it run. And of course, I can use the blow tool to push it to the side if I want to. And then I can dry it. Let's try the markers. Now these aren't quite as transparent as I would expect them to be with their default setting. So what you could do is you could create your separate layer for your markers, set that to multiply for the blend mode. Then you'll probably get something that looks a little bit more like what you would expect from a marker. And then of course there's the eraser if you want different kinds of erasers. And get this more broken up one. If you want kind of a speckled effect. If you want some different paint splats, you can go back to the watercolor and there's the splat preset. You can add little splats to your canvas like this. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you can create your own brushes from dabs. You basically just make a dab such as a PNG of something that looks like this splat here. And then your brush just basically repeats that splat, but it rotates it and scales it and makes it look a little more random when you're painting with it. Now, last but not least, let's jump into the preferences here and let's take a look at a few last things. If you don't like that show new artwork dialog, you can turn that on and off here so that it's not asking you to create a new canvas. If you find that these tools and buttons and all these labels are too small, you can increase the interface scale. So for example, I could scale this up to 140, click on OK, and now everything got much bigger. If I want it to be smaller, I can put it back down to 120. If I want to zoom at the cursor rather than from the center of the canvas, I can change that here. I can control the JPEG quality. I recommend that you don't save as JPEG though. Then you can control the amount of memory that your computer uses for Rebelle. Adding more memory might speed up some of the things like water trickling and things like that, but adding too much won't be good for your computer because you need some for background applications. So set it to maybe like 60 or 70% of your total RAM. If we go down to the color tab, you can control the color of your wetness. You can control your stencil color. You can control the sensitivity of mixing colors. So for example, if I put down this yellow here, a red, and I put it next to it, if I hold down X on my keyboard, I can start to mix that color together to get an intermediate color. As you can see here, holding down X, clicking on the color that I want to mix with, and then I'm getting more and more of that color each time. If I click on the red, then I'm going to start getting more and more of that. And then if I go back to preferences, this mixed color sensitivity controls how many times you have to click to get more of a shift in color each time. Tablet we already looked at. Let's look at keyboard. If you want to set a keyboard shortcut or a Wacom tablet express key shortcut for any of these features, you can do that. You can go through each of these here and you can see what the shortcuts are, or you can change them to shortcuts or keys that you like. So I think without getting into too much more, that gives you a pretty decent idea of what you can do with Rebelle and how to get started with it. So the last thing I want to do is share my final thoughts on Rebelle 2. I had a lot of fun messing with it. I used Rebelle version 1 a few times and it didn't quite hook me. It seemed kind of cool that water could trickle and stuff like that, but I don't think I honestly gave it enough time to really appreciate it as a painting application because I didn't try to do any kind of serious painting in it. But as soon as I did that self-portrait, I really spent about 6 hours diving into it and learning it and figuring out its nuances. And I actually like it quite a bit. I probably will do a lot more painting in it because it's a very simple program, but it gives you a lot of really realistic results. In other art applications, there are a lot more tools and I feel a lot more comfortable working because I have everything I need. And there's a lot that's missing from Rebelle. But the thing is, Rebelle's kind of a niche application. It's compact and low profile for a reason because that's what people who use it want. So overall, I gotta say I'm really happy with the results that I got using Rebelle for this portrait painting. So there you go, that's my review of Rebelle 2. If you enjoyed this video, take a quick second to like this video. And if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. I have a lot more digital art videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.